Westone here with Soils in Sync. My garden was destroyed by persistent herbicides more than once. I'm going to show you how to avoid them, how to identify them in your garden, and how to remediate the problem. Persistent herbicide can linger for 10 plus years. This is no joke and it has become a real risk for farmers and gardeners. I now have to be extremely cautious about my sources of compost and mulches, and it causes me to have to write off entire categories of compost materials. These herbicides include Aminopyralid, which is what I'll refer to because that's the problem I had, clopyralid, which is a similar product, picloram, and aminocyclopyrachlor. The last one was known to have affected pine trees and spruce trees in people's lawns. These products go by many trade names, and you can pause the video here to see those or look it up on Google. These herbicides are used for several purposes. They're used on roadsides, utility right-of-ways, railroads, used in forestry, and on trail edges. Most commonly, though, they will be applied to pastures to eliminate noxious and invasive weeds or broadleaves. But they will not affect forage grasses. The aminopyralid will absorb into the grass, leaving it unaffected. And that grass is then fed to livestock, where the herbicide will remain active in the livestock manure, and then the herbicide will remain potent even after composting that manure. Hence why persistent herbicides are persistent and have ended up everywhere. Some garden plants are sensitive to these herbicides at only a few parts per billion, which is why they can be problematic for 10 plus years and why they're so catastrophic. According to Dow Chemical, the best way to tell if persistent herbicide is your problem is with a bioassay. This basically just means observing the foliage deformality. It'll be most obvious on peas and beans, tomatoes, potatoes. Carrots will not even germinate. Note how the leaves are often cupped. On tomatoes, the leaves are folded and twisted. This is what your plants could look like for 10 plus years, assuming they even germinate, if you do not remediate the problem immediately. Most gardeners probably just assume this is some unknowable, incurable disease. Here are some pictures of my peas. Note the cupping. If you've gotten some compost that you are unsure about, test it before you apply it to your garden. You can test it by simply planting peas or beans into it and letting them grow so that about 6 leaves have developed. By then, the leaf deformality should be apparent or not. After my first bout with aminopyralid contamination, I tested a second batch of compost I had gotten, and thank God I did because I would have destroyed my garden a second time. Later, I added a new garden bed where it had previously been this awkward gap between my fences. Lo and behold, in that new bed, aminopyralids had made their way into that space, and I had to remediate the problem again. After that, I had to change my compost and mulch sources to only those that I was absolutely certain were not contaminated. I deduced that the affected material had come from city property. I'd gotten some grass clippings and organic material from the city yard waste site that had apparently been contaminated. I started to notice that at least 4 different city properties all showed the telltale signs of persistent herbicide poisoning. The city seemed to be the culprit. I spoke with the head of public works to notify him of the problem and suggest that he stop using this herbicide. He claimed that it would have been at least 9 years since the previous director was in charge that this herbicide might have been used. I doubt that he was telling the truth, but giving him the benefit of the doubt means that this material had enough potency to ruin my garden 10 years after its original application. At this point, I would be inclined to test all materials in the following categories. Again, this is as simple as planting a bunch of peas or beans into the compost and allowing about 6 leaves to develop. By then, you should be able to see the leaf deformality or not. This is really a massively damaging product because it radically limits what I'm able to use for garden fertility. 200 miles away at my grandparents' house, they had a potted tomato plant on their porch. I noticed the leaves showed a classic deformity. I asked my grandma where she got the potting soil for that plant. She'd bought a bag of commercial compost, bagged compost from the hardware store. I couldn't believe it. I felt nothing was safe. I talked to a farmer at the farmer's market about this problem. He told a story about how he'd applied an herbicide to his alfalfa field. Well over 5 years later, he could still see the herbicide damage because the foliage was much healthier in the areas that he'd missed. I've gotten what I thought were basic lawn grass clippings that were contaminated. That was the batch I tested and told you about earlier. If you're not 100% sure about the source of your compost, do a test planting first. So, how did I remediate my garden? These herbicides generally do not affect monocots like grasses, and they do affect dicots like most garden vegetables. We can use this knowledge to help remediate and remove the herbicide from the soil, and it's actually not as hard as you'd think. The first step is to remove any contaminated plants from the area, but you have to be careful where you dump those plants because the residue will affect most non-grass crops, including trees and woody brush. So do not compost it and do not feed it to livestock. The second step is to plant a cereal grass cover crop because, again, grasses are not affected by the herbicide. This could be oats, rye, wheat, barley, millet. Let that cover crop mature as long as possible. The longer it grows, the more likely it will suck up the herbicide. After those grasses are sufficiently mature, cut and remove that cover crop residue from the affected area. And again, dump those contaminated plants somewhere where it will not affect production crops. Again, do not feed it to livestock. Do not compost it. That residue will affect non-grass crops, including woody species. I've had success with only having to do this with one treatment. Multiple treatments may be necessary if you have a very bad contamination, but I do not know. There are some links in the description to more information about persistent herbicides. The good news is that you don't have to suffer 10 years of persistent herbicide damage. The bad news is that you will probably lose production for the better part of an entire growing season. If you or someone you know is using these products, please let them know of the far-reaching consequences. These products devalue and degrade their land. They end up in food products. They end up in your neighbor's garden, and they do not go away anytime soon. Users may be liable for selling products contaminated with these herbicides. Dow Chemical puts the blame on users of the herbicide, saying they should have read the instructions. Let us know your experience in the comments so we can all learn how to better avoid this problem.